episode 35 of Top of Mind with Consilio Wealth. Hao and I are back today to talk about top of news. And first item is going to be auto workers worry jobs will go away with EV production, ongoing strikes and whatnot. So we thought we would unpack that. There is some interesting stuff going on in the CD market. Has anyone tried to buy a CD lately? Good luck. We've had a couple of situations recently. And rates might look good, and then there's no inventory. And I did some quick Googling before I hit record, and we'll share some interesting stuff that we found with not even an inverted yield curve, like a wave yield curve in the CD market right now.
It's a twisted.
It's twisted.
Curve. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a whipsaw.
Yeah.
Super strange. Interest rates jumped today with the retail sales smashing expectations. And finally, this is back in the news now, China's real estate implosion with Evergrande. This is starting to come back up to the top of the news, and we thought we would unpack that as well. Today is October 17th, 2023. It's 9:47 in the morning Pacific time, and we are recording this a little bit early because our team is headed out for a retreat. We get together twice a year in person. We chat through some of the upcoming objectives that we're trying to accomplish here internally. We work through some things that we can smooth within our external client process, and we just get together and have a good time. We are a remote firm, so we've got 8 people in 5 states, and so we like to get together twice a year to actually see everybody, live and in color, as I say. So let's kick it off today. How we should start with this whole auto worker thing with the EV production. This was in the news recently, and this is kind of interesting with the push to EV. So what was your article that you wanted to quote, and what were the insights that you could share with our listeners?
Yeah. A couple updates on the strike. UAW is still striking with the big three domestic automakers, Stellantis, Ford, and GM. And I think the biggest pain points, other than like CEO pay raises, the other one is the type of work being done. So I think if you have any insights on unions, they are typically protective of the type of work that's being done, right? And if you work on engines, you're always going to work on engines. And if you sweep floors, that's not part of your job function. You're taking jobs away from someone else, which is somewhat backwards in terms of where work has kind of evolved over the last, 100 years. I could definitely see where the protections had to come in from. So EVs, right, the next evolution of cars, at least from what we see, hybrids, EVs, away from internal combustion engines. If your job function is to make engines, these new EVs don't have any engines. They have
way smaller.
Motors. Yeah. So the part of the union negotiation or the contract, they're trying to focus on protecting, internal combustion manufacturing. If you stamp the block or you bore the blocks out, that's your only job, right? You're part of the union. Your job is relatively protected to an extent that could be good, but the market is shifting beyond that, right? If all your job is creating V8 engines, that might go away, and I think that's what the union is definitely worried about. But then there's good reason for that too. At the same time, just yesterday, Ford announced 700 workers are being laid off in their EV plants because they can't get them up and running. So imagine working for one of the big three, and they can just lay you off because their operational cycles aren't up to par. And they don't need the employees, right? Only to hire you back in 3 months. But you're on either reduced pay, furloughed, or no pay in some cases, and you don't have union representation. And Ford expects to, leave you unpaid for 3 months just to hire you back. What kind of career is that, right? And I'm trying to be neutral here because the union, in this case, would probably protect those Ford EV plant workers. But at the same time, they're kind of keeping progress stalled with the introduction or production of more EV and EV type of specialist workers, where unions don't have protections with these EV plants yet. And I think Tesla is a good example.
Are the EV plants not a part of the union?
Correct. Yeah, they are not part of the union. They're like a co-production with like Samsung Electronics and Ford, and they have a different workforce.
Interesting, and that's because those specific job functions are completely different.
Yeah, they're not under the contract.
I guess specifically with the engine. I mean, the body of the Ford F-150 is the same, right? So those, but interesting that they're able to do that same work without a union member.
Correct.
Huh.
Correct. And then without the protections of the union, Ford can, essentially fire people.
Yeah.
On a whim.
Lay off.
Yeah.
Hire again. Yeah.
Yeah. And will these people boomerang? Maybe. And unfortunately, they do for the most part because that's kind of what they knew. As I've always worked at the Ford EV plant, and even though they treated me poorly, I'm going to go back. I think that's where the union protections are definitely valuable for society and for workers, but at the same time, on the flip side of that coin, they are a real impediment to progress.
It's saying Ford had temporarily closed their EV plant this summer to upgrade its production capability. The company said that its latest layoff is related to multiple constraints, including supply chain, working through processing and delivering vehicles that are held for quality checks after restarting production in August, not that long ago. Mm-hmm. And the company said that it will cut one of the 3 shifts at its electric vehicle center in Michigan, and it will rotate the layoffs between those 3 shifts. Interesting. I wonder how many, 700 people to me doesn't sound like a lot for a huge company like Ford, but that actually probably is a decent percentage for that particular
warehouse or the plant, right?
Yeah, the plant.
So yeah, we hope there's a resolution. I think the CEO pay is, especially for relatively shrinking industry, has outstripped the growth or the value created from those CEOs, right? So again, I'm supportive of CEO pay if they create value. I think the NVIDIA CEO creates tons of value, and he should be compensated for it. But same time, if you're not generating any kind of profits or growing profits, then your compensation shouldn't outstrip that growth, right?
Yeah. Interesting. Well, we'll see how this story unfolds and if it ultimately has a larger impact on the economy. Let's move to CD rates. Anyone tried to buy a CD lately? They're hard to find.
I have for clients, yeah.
Yeah. And there's a rate that's stated, and then you're like, I want to buy that thing. And you click it, and there's none available. Yeah. So maybe you can unpack again. And for our listeners, we talked about this a bit in episode 34, our last episode. So if you haven't checked that one out, please do listen in. But some interesting things have happened in the last 2 weeks with regards to what CDs are paying and their available inventory. So what's going on in the CD market?
Yeah, and again, I don't want to minimize any conflicts, but with Israel-Hamas conflict bubbling up, rates dropped because there's risk baked into the market, right? If rates drop, and you're a bank, let's say you're Bank of America, Chris, if you're offering 2-year CDs that, using a blind example, 5.5%.
Sure.
And Israel gets attacked by Hamas, they respond in kind, rates drop. What are you doing with that 5.5% 2-year CDs that you want maybe $10 billion worth of?
I'm losing money is what I'm doing with that.
Yeah. So I'm going to pull that back.
Yeah.
Close it, right? Reduce that inventory.
If I have a call feature, a call feature for our listeners is, let's say I have a 2-year CD, maybe it's callable after the first year, which means if rates are below that 5.5% rate, I can basically pay off that CD early, forcing you to refinance at a lower rate.
Yeah, or on the flip side, I have a $10 billion I need to raise. I'm going to lower that 5.5 to 4.9 for a 2-year CD. Or even worse, 4.7, 4.8, because one, I'm a bank, I need profits. What am I getting with CDs? Or I'm getting deposits, but in turn, I'm taking those deposits and loaning that money out.
Right.
But if mortgage rates are 7.5% and credit card rates are at 24%, how much loan demand am I actually getting? Outside of the people who are just spending like crazy. We'll get to that.
And we'll get to this in a minute.
Yeah.
I mean, we know that mortgage demand is down. I can't quote the percentage, but we do know that spending has maintained, particularly with today retail sales coming out and smashing up expectations, right? Like people continue to spend. But yeah, if I'm taking in money at 5.5% for a CD, I have to loan it out at more than that.
Yeah.
With some sort of a factor, say like a mortgage. So if I don't have a lot of mortgage demand, maybe I don't need the deposits, and so then I lower my rates. And that's what's going on in the big banks right now. That's why your big bank is not paying you anything on their savings and checking accounts, and their CDs are quite a bit lower than regional banks or other banks because they don't need your money. So the highest paying CDs are outside of the big banks, and again, if you can find them.
Yeah. Well, banks are a for-profit entity, right? If I'm paying a pool of money at 5.5%, and I could barely loan out maybe 25% of that pool,
right?
I'm not making any money, even if it's like 10% interest rates.
Yeah. So I'm looking at an image here of, let's just call this a yield curve for CDs, and I'll quote a couple of things here for our listeners. So
it's weird.
It's weird. Actually, where's this one that you pasted into the deck here?
This first one is from my credit union.
Okay.
Yeah, Golden One in Sacramento.
Okay, interesting. So your credit union looks a little bit more normal. So 3-month CD paying 5.45%, 6-month CD 5.45, 9-month 5.5, a little higher, 12-month 5.5, 18-month 5.5, 2-year drops 5.35, 3-year drops 5.1, 4-year down to 5%, and 5-year down to 4.9%, which is, that's kind of normal. That's basically banks predicting that rates are going to fall, and ultimately, they don't want to lock in a higher rate for the 5-year term. These rates are callable after 1 year as well, correct?
That's the rub. Yep. So you could get 10% for all the bank errors. It's calling it back.
Yeah, interesting.
And for everyone's information, call features are something that's installed by the borrower for the right to purchase the principal back in kind, in full, and you're getting cash back. So good luck reinvesting that. That's basically what it's saying.
You're still earning more at 5 or 5.5%. You're still earning more on this CD than you would in a high yield savings account. So I did a quick Google search here for high yield savings accounts, like I do. I'm just on the NerdWallet page. I like the ones that don't have any hoops you have to jump through. So there's certain ones here. You have to make a deposit, and you have to make a withdrawal, and you have to jump through a hoop, and then you get their like bigger rate. So I typically quote into like Amex high yield savings or the Marcus high yield savings product, or there's one that I actually just found through Citi, and those I know for a fact that the Amex one and the high yield or the Marcus one, that there aren't any hoops you have to jump through. It's just money in, earn interest, money back out. Amex is quoting 4.3% on their high yield savings account. Marcus is 4.4%. Citi is 4.35. I also looked up the Apple Card. I think the Apple Card is 4.15. I think Goldman Sachs is actually trying to get out of that relationship from what I've heard. But anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about. So Amex also offers CDs. And I actually got this thing in the mail yesterday, and I sent it to Hao. I texted him. And it was on high yield savings accounts and CDs. And I just want to quote our listeners the wonky yield curve that Amex will pay you on a CD. So get this. You want to lock up for 11 months with Amex? They'll give you 5%.
Makes sense.
12 months? 4.25%.
Kind of makes sense, yeah.
18 months? 1%.
Makes no sense.
24 months? 4.75%. 36 months? 1.15%. 48 months? 1.2%. And finally, 60 months, back up to 3%. What?
It makes no sense. The 36 month and 48 months, which is 3 and 4 years, that's 1% interest rate.
It's like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
I need to read the fine print here. Are these Are these callable? Is that, I mean, if maybe they're not callable. Maybe that's why they fall so much. Let's see. For CD rates subject, blah, blah, blah. CD must be funded within 60 calendar days at the time we approve it. Interest rates will be disclosed. Early CD withdrawals may be subject to significant penalties, which could cause you to lose some of your principal. Please see the agreement. I don't see quickly, just in reading the fine print, that these are callable. Maybe that's why they have such a wonky yield curve here, because everyone else is giving you much, much higher stated rates. Even on Fidelity's website, if you just Google like CD rates on Fidelity, they're pretty high. And then they start falling off. But maybe that's because they're callable. So like, yeah, sure, 10 years or 5 years, 5.75 or 4.55, sure. But we call it in a year.
Yeah, and to be clear, Fidelity does have access to not only certain banks, they have access to an entire marketplace of CDs. So you might have better luck with Fidelity, but you're most likely in the secondary market where we mentioned bonds, right? They don't typically trade at 100%. There's going to be 101, 99%, whatever the interest rates are doing. CDs are the same way. So if you're willing to venture into that space, that it's not as clear cut. There's math behind it that does justify pricing, but it's not as clear cut as, you know, buying a CD from your bank for $100 and getting $105 back in a year.
Can you unpack that a little bit? So if I buy a CD from my bank, I put $100 in, I get 5%, boom, done, easy. But if I buy a CD from my broker, like, or my custodian, you know, Schwab, Fidelity, etc., that's what's called a brokered CD.
Correct.
And that it doesn't matter where it's from, because it's not actually from Fidelity. It's from, you know,
Goldman,
insert bank
Morgan
name.
Stanley, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
What's a brokered CD, and how's it different than just a normal walk in the bank and buy a CD?
Yeah, it's just kind of like buying cars, just either lease or buy. It's just the method of purchase is different. So you're getting the same product, the same CD.
Okay.
But Fidelity does give you access to more banks than as if you're going to Bank of America, because what is Bank of America going to offer you? They're going to offer you Bank of America CDs only,
CD,
right?
yeah.
So if you are shopping around, it's probably easier to go the brokered route. But there's the issue of new issue versus secondary issue, right? And that's what I mentioned with the secondary issue is once, let's say Chris bought a 5-year CD 2 years ago, that thing is moving in price. And if he was willing to sell it, which is pretty rare, he would have to sell it at a discount because 2 years ago rates were really low. Now they're much higher, right?
Right.
So you're not getting an interest rate per se. What you're getting is a discounted CD, and it steps up every year. That's called an amortization. And people are used to that with mortgages where they amortize away their principal. This is different where the principal grows, the amortization, the difference between Chris's CD and what the market rate is now. That doesn't come in the form of interest rates. That comes in the form of principal being added onto your CD as it approaches maturity.
And so, interesting. But my CD, let's say I locked in my CD at 2%, you know, a year and a half ago. I'm still earning 2% only if I sell it. But if I sell it, I'm probably selling it. I wouldn't. I mean, I wouldn't. Yeah, I wouldn't. So probably wouldn't sell. I guess it's math, is what you're saying. It's just like selling a bond.
Yeah. So whatever the difference between, let's say rates are 5% now, and that 2% represents a 3% gap, meaning I'm not going to buy that CD from Chris unless I get a pretty steep discount because I could just go get a 5%. Why would I pick up his 2% CD?
Right. Now, I thought that brokered CDs trade more like bonds, though. Is that just because of what you're describing, because they have an open secondary market, whereas a bank CD, you generally can't sell to someone else? You generally liquidate early from the bank, and the bank penalizes you with like a lesser interest?
Yeah, so yes and yes. So brokered CD, you can buy new issues directly from the bank or buy a secondary. That's where the price differences will come into play with the secondary market.
Got it.
And yeah, what you mentioned with wanting to cash in your CD early, if it's through Chase, you go to Chase or you sell it on the open market.
Right. Okay. Interesting.
But yeah, Amex is probably the weirdest I've seen.
That's super weird. Yeah.
Really weird. I went through Bank of America. Their 25-month CD pays 2.96. Like, where's that 5% that's been advertised, right?
Well, yeah.
Our friends.
You can get 1% at Amex for 18 months, or you can get 4.75 for 24. So
yeah,
take your pick.
Yeah, our friends at KeyBank are doing something pretty similar to Amex here. 13 months, 4.879, pretty good rate, right? And then once you get to the 5-year term, which they don't offer 2 to 4 years for some reason, but that 5-year CD pays 0.05%.
Whoa.
Yeah. And that's not a typo. That just means that KeyBank does not want to lock in any savings money or deposit money for 5 years.
Not 0.5%. 0.05%.
0.05, yeah.
Wow.
And then down to Chase, which seems kind of normal, kind of, for a big bank. Once you get past the 1-year mark, the rate drops to 3% flat. No, sorry, past the 1-year mark, which is 454 days in their language, 0.02%. So Chase, you're getting a steal with KeyBank if you're going being on 2 years, but Chase is offering 0.02.
Notice too how, so this Chase graphic, 1 to 10,000, 10,000 to 100,000, 100,000 plus, and the 180 day or 365 plus is the only one that you get a little bump.
Only one, yeah.
No, actually just the 180 day to 270 day. The 6 to 8th month CD is the only one that you get a bump on.
It goes from 296 to 4.88 in a weird bump during that 180 day, 269 day range.
No, I mean, if you give Chase $10,000, they're going to give you 4% on that 180 day, 6 to 8 month CD. But if you give them 100,000 plus, they give you 5%. So you get a 1% bump on that. But that's the only one where they actually bump you up
for more money.
Uh-huh.
So weird things going on. It is supply and demand. Think of it from the bank's point of view. They're here to make money. They're not here to give away money. So if you're thinking of going and getting a 5% CD longer term, it just you do have to search for it. Not to say it's like this unicorn that doesn't exist, but it's a lot harder than people realize.
And beware about call features.
Yep.
Let's move to retail sales. So retail sales absolutely smashed expectations today, and that ultimately has caused interest rates to jump, because the good news that people keep spending means the Fed might have more work to do to put a lid on the economy. What's your take? What was released today and what's going on?
Yeah, retail sales grew at 0.7% over the prior month. So that's still, it's slowing from the August 0.8% gain. But keep in mind, inflation was up month over month, 0.4% in the same time period. So people, you would think the higher prices is causing people to spend more. No, it's people spending more is causing people to spend more. They're just buying more. And I think we're seeing it with cars, right? The average car payment now is $763 per month. That's average. So that means nearly half of the car payments out there are above $763. And I would venture to say there's a significant amount above $1,000 single car payment, right? That's one car you're paying $1,000 a month on.
Yeah.
That doesn't include insurance, doesn't include maintenance. So the spending is probably way too high for the Fed's comfort level, right? And I think the interest rate market is already responding in kind, right? We saw the probability of a rate hike in December go from 34% up to 43%. And again, this was just a few weeks ago was a 10% odds in an increase in December. So we're inching towards one more rate hike and more likely higher rates for longer.
But still, what we just said is that the market's already pricing in. Basically, the market doesn't care about one more rate hike because the market's already pricing in rates falling here into the future.
Yeah.
Based on these CD rates that we quoted, right?
Correct. Mm-hmm. So weird dynamics going on where CD rates should have justifiably higher yields. But again, we're in this weird imbalance where people are spending on one side and people are super saving on the other side. So there's this tug and pull going on.
Spending grew across most categories last month, with sales at specialty stores advancing the most by 3%. What's a specialty store? What's that category?
I don't know. Yeah.
Like Sephora versus
I would guess like
probably not Walgreens.
Yeah, I would guess like a bike store versus like a Walmart. Yeah, I would.
It's definitely not a Walmart. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Online sales and car purchases also grew at a strong clip, both rising at 1.1% in September and August.
Yeah.
The two weakest sales categories last month were clothing and electronics, declining 0.8% during the same period. Well, we'll see if Apple's new iPhone can have a bump to that electronic spend. Clothing spend could bump here soon with the holidays, but then also student loan payments kicking back in. I wonder if that's what's being watched too, is the student loan payments kick back in. You know, maybe this data is still from the last month of, I don't have my student loan payments. Yep. Spend it.
YOLO, yeah.
Yeah, totally. And maybe we'll see people spend less here in the remainder of the year.
Yeah, well,
this quote here.
We'd hope so for their sake, right? How's this sustainable?
This quote here from David Russell, Global Head of Market Strategy at TradeStation. Whoever that is, I don't know who TradeStation is, but he says the U.S. consumer cannot stop spending.
Yeah, in other words, water is wet.
Yep. Puts us on track for a strong GDP number later this month. It also gives the Fed zero reason to loosen policy, which keeps the 10-year Treasury yield pushing towards 5%.
Yeah.
Wow, interesting. Okay, so we think one more rate hike.
Yeah,
at least.
Yeah, and again, the dynamic is banks are going to look out for their bottom line. They're not going to give away free money. So, we may see higher CD rates posted, but it would be a struggle to find something that pays 6% or 5%, you know what I mean? Whatever the rates end up at.
And once again, they don't need your money, right?
They don't need
I can see why maybe Amex. Well, this is what doesn't make any sense with Amex, is this weird 5%, 1%, 5%, 1%, 3%, which doesn't make any sense. But Amex, to my knowledge, doesn't do mortgages. So Amex does things like personal loans.
Yeah.
If I'm going to send out a personal loan at 6 or 7 or 8%, or issue a credit card at 25%, I can afford to pay more. And with spending, you would think that there would be a rise in credit card balances. I know that there is. And personal loans. I don't know the answer to that. But you'd think that a company like Amex would need more deposits versus, Chase and the regional banks don't, because mortgage demand has fallen.
Business loan demand too.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's all wrong, but I mean, that makes sense to me, and that makes sense why a company like Amex would offer a better CD rate, yet they're the ones that are bouncing around their rates so much, which is super, super strange. So, anyway, moving on. China's real estate market. This has been in and out of the news for, when did this first hit the news? Maybe a year ago. This is the Evergrande issue. China is very, very overbuilt with their real estate market. And they have what are called ghost towns. And if you look this up, there's even a 60 Minutes on this, China real estate ghost towns. And they are huge, huge developments that it would be like if you walked into a mall and there was a sign where the subway goes, and there's a sign where the Panda Express goes, and there's signs where the Gap goes, but there's not actually those stores there. It's just like, hey, this is what would go here if anything were here. Yeah. That's what these cities look like.
Yeah.
And so the problem that's coming to a head is that real estate is built with debt. It's generally not built with cash. And that model works once either a building is fully leased up, and then that's a asset that is stable, or stabilized is what it's called. And then that asset is sold to like a pension fund or an insurance company, and that then cashes out the developer, pays off typically a variable credit line.
Yep.
Or maybe it's a condo development, right? So it's built with credit, condos are sold, money comes in, that pays off the construction debt, and you move on. Well, that's not happening here because there are so many units that are not at all sold. So, how I want to turn it over to you. This is back in the news recently. Why is it back in the news? And just what's your take on what's going on over there and what possibly could happen?
Yeah, we're going off of a pretty great article from Lynette Lopez on Business Insider. So if you want to look this up, this is actually a really good article to read. First, let's kind of unpack, at least how she writes it, unpack how the funding mechanism for the Chinese government works, right? So we have property taxes here in the States where it's like every year it's a tax, right? In their scheme, it's a selling of government land and property to fund the government, but the sale occurs typically just once, right? So in ours is the tax revenue is recurring every year, right? So you got a community that's growing. The general obligation is growing because more and more people are consistently paying their property taxes here in the States.
Who's buying that land? Is it the residents?
The developers.
Developers.
Yeah, so in China does not have property tax. Might sound great, but it's a one-time transaction when you're selling land, right? So that's how China funds their, at least the local municipalities are funding their basic services like fixing roads and pensions. So they sell the land to developers, and then in turn use that to fund services for the local community. But you can see where that kind of has a upper limit to it, right? Because you only have so much land to sell for one. But
And what about demand?
yeah, and you got one. Well, we're looking at the government, where how do they keep funding the government? They got to sell more and more land, right?
Yeah.
And these developers have been buying more and more land, I guess, with subsidies, right? We're gonna buy these properties back from you, or our people, more importantly, are gonna buy these properties back from you to live in. But this has been going on for so long, where the population of 1.4 billion people, but there's housing enough for 3 billion people. So one, if every man, woman, and child bought a house in China, you would still have 1.6 billion vacant properties.
What?
Yeah, billion. So they built enough property to house four United States populations that are uninhabited.
This says China has a population of 1.4 billion, but it has built housing for a population of 3 billion,
With
according
a B,
to expert
yeah.
with a B.
Yeah.
So they have a 1.6 billion. God, if we could just ship some of those units over to the U.S., we'd solve a problem.
The housing problem, yeah, God. Maybe that contributed to the housing problem, right? Because the amount of steel, rebar, wood, right?
Yeah,
Housing
could push.
materials.
Actually, interesting. Yeah, could push costs up. Would push costs up.
Now that they've slowed down, what is the price of lumber done, right? The price of aluminum and copper done.
Many of the mega developments became empty monuments to Beijing's insatiable desire for growth.
Correct. And their growth mechanism is by selling property, selling land. So what are they going to do, right? Sell it to the people willing to build or construct on that land in turn for tax revenue, essentially.
And in Shenyang, farmers have even taken over the development of empty mansions for cattle grazing. There's literally a picture here.
Of a cow living it up in a big mansion.
Well, a mansion's backyard. There's a picture here of like it's a finished building, looks really nice, and then there's a farm looking fence that's kind of like just fencing in this courtyard looking thing. There's a cow staring at the camera. Wow.
Yeah. Well, he's probably yelling at the camera guy to get off his property because
That's fair.
Yeah. So this has a cycle of economic pressure, meaning they can't build anymore. They can't generate new tax revenue, right? There's one, who's going to buy any undeveloped land at this point when you have so much developed land already?
Mm-hmm.
And people who are wanting to buy, they're saying, well, prices are crashing. I'm going to wait to buy. So there's this frozen market of economic development that isn't happening in China. That probably won't happen for years. And I think the development companies that have bought all this land and they built all these buildings, they're not selling them. So I think that could create such a credit bubble and credit burst. I think this is probably, we're seeing the early innings of a Chinese economic implosion.
Wow. This is a great article, and this is interesting because this has been in the news. The market actually sold off when this hit the news, and again, I'm thinking that was about a year ago, and I was like, whoa, this could be a huge issue. This whole Evergrande default, and then nothing really happened, right? Oh, the debt payment got made or something got missed. Like I remember it hitting the news, but then it sort of just got brushed under the rug, and now recently it's coming up again. This is interesting.
Yeah, the reason to invest in China, at least prior to this, was their massive and growing middle class, right?
Very well-performing middle class, better than almost anywhere else, I believe.
But now their demographics have shifted pretty quickly, where in 2022 their population has shrunk.
Yeah.
And now they're, in terms of retirement age, there's one retiree to every 3 workers. So there's
That's
an
like
imbalance.
the Japan problem.
Yeah, there's a massive imbalance because of their old policies that are coming around to bite them. Right? Remember the one-child policy to prevent overpopulation?
It's coming back. Wow.
That's becoming a big issue where, on top of that, their COVID policies are draconian. I don't know how else to say that. And their relationships with the U.S. and Europe have been under strain in the last, 6-7 years.
Mm-hmm.
And it's coming, more heated in the last 2 years. But all these companies are offshoring, right? What is Apple doing in terms of supply chain? They're looking to Southeast Asia, South Asia, India, right? So if these big corporations are continually offshoring out of China because they were such a business-friendly environment, and suddenly they're not, I think a lot of mega corporations are suddenly looking for different supply chains.
Interesting. Okay. Well, this has been an interesting story as it unfolds. It likely will take some time to really fully get exposed and unfold. I mean, it's been at least a year since this first hit the news, as I keep saying. We'll continue to follow up with it on our listeners and as we have more information. But that's interesting. It's interesting insights on what's happening, outside of our walls here in the U.S.
Yeah, and it affects what diversified portfolios. That's something to watch out for.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. Okay, wonderful. Well, that's all the time that we have for today's episode. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. And we hope that this episode was
a fun one.
Yeah. That was a fun one. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Hal. Talk to you again soon.
See you, Chris.